When we imagine the Middle Ages, we often picture quiet villages, peaceful castles, and calm starlit skies. It's easy to think that once the sun went down, medieval life slowed into silence. But the truth is far more chaotic. Medieval nights were anything but calm. They were noisy, dangerous, unpredictable, and sometimes downright terrifying. First, let's talk about darkness. Today we take light for granted. With a flip of a switch, our homes and streets glow instantly, and even when we step outside, streetlights, storefronts, and glowing windows guide our way. But in the medieval world, darkness was absolute. Once the sun slipped below the horizon, the transformation was immediate and dramatic. The familiar paths, buildings, and landmarks that people relied on during the day vanished into shadow. Streets were unlit, and the faint glow from scattered candles or hearth fires barely reached beyond the walls of individual homes. For most people, nightfall did not simply mean the end of work, it meant entering a world where visibility shrank to only a few feet in front of them. The sky might have been filled with stars, but starlight alone offered little practical help when navigating the hazards of a medieval town. Candles and oil lamps existed, but they were not casually used the way we use flashlights or phone lights today. Wax candles were expensive, often reserved for wealthier households, churches, or special occasions. Poorer families relied on tallow candles made from animal fat, which burned unevenly, produced thick smoke, and gave off a weak, flickering glow that could barely illuminate a room, let alone the outside world. Oil lamps required fuel, which also cost money, and maintaining a steady flame demanded attention and care. Even the simple act of lighting a candle was not trivial. Fire had to be carefully preserved from the hearth, and matches did not exist. Because of these limitations, most people simply allowed darkness to take over once the sun set, conserving their precious sources of light for only the most necessary moments. Entire towns fell into shadow, and the darkness was not softened by distant electric glow or light pollution. It was deep, heavy, and complete. Stepping outside at night meant moving through an environment where shapes blurred together and familiar routes became uncertain. Roads were uneven, often nothing more than dirt paths carved by foot traffic and wagon wheels. Rain turned them into mud, and in dry conditions they hardened into rutted surfaces filled with holes and stones. Without light, these imperfections became traps. A misplaced step could twist an ankle, send someone falling into a ditch, or cause them to collide with a wooden post or low-hanging beam. Urban streets posed their own hazards. Waste disposal systems were primitive, and refuse was frequently thrown into the street. Animal droppings, leftover food, broken pottery, and household waste created a hazardous ground layer that was difficult to see even in daylight, and nearly impossible to avoid at night. Open drains carried wastewater along the sides of roads, sometimes covered, sometimes not. In darkness, people risked stepping into these foul channels, soaking their shoes and clothing in contaminated water. The smell alone could be overwhelming, but the greater danger was infection. Cuts and scrapes were common, and exposure to filth increased the chance of illness. For travelers unfamiliar with a town, nighttime movement was even more dangerous. Without street signs, maps, or consistent layout, visitors relied on memory and landmarks. At night, those landmarks disappeared. Buildings blended into one another, and narrow alleyways created confusing mazes. Someone attempting to find lodging after dark could easily become lost, wandering in circles while the town grew quieter and more threatening. In larger towns, authorities sometimes appointed night watchmen, but their effectiveness varied widely. These watchmen carried lanterns or torches and walked designated routes, calling out the hours or warning of danger. However, their numbers were small compared to the size of many towns. They could not be everywhere at once, and their presence often offered only limited reassurance. In some cases, watchmen were poorly paid and not particularly motivated, leading to inconsistent patrols. A lone watchman's lantern might briefly illuminate a corner of a street before disappearing, leaving darkness to close in again. For many residents, hearing the watchman's call was comforting, but it also underscored how little protection existed. The darkness created opportunities for those willing to exploit it. Criminal activity increased after sunset because identification was difficult and escape was easier. A thief could slip through shadows, grab unattended goods, and vanish into narrow alleys. Someone intent on assault could hide in doorways or behind carts, waiting for an unsuspecting passerby. Without reliable lighting, witnesses were scarce, and even if someone saw a figure, they might not recognize who it was. The fear of such encounters shaped behavior. Many people avoided leaving their homes at night unless absolutely necessary. Those who did often carried simple forms of protection, such as a staff or knife, though these offered limited safety. The darkness also amplified sounds, making every footstep seem louder and every distant noise more suspicious. The creak of a wooden sign, the scuffle of an animal, or the whisper of wind could trigger unease. People were accustomed to interpreting these sounds carefully, trying to distinguish harmless movement from potential threat. Weather made darkness even more oppressive. On cloudy nights, when moonlight was blocked, visibility dropped further. Rain dampened torches and extinguished candles, plunging areas into deeper shadow. Fog could roll into low-lying towns, turning darkness into a thick wall that swallowed shapes entirely. Wind rattled shutters and caused flames to flicker, creating moving shadows that played tricks on the eye. The psychological impact of such conditions was significant. Without reliable vision, imagination filled the gaps. Shapes seemed to shift, and familiar objects took on strange forms. A pile of firewood might resemble a crouched figure, and a swaying branch could appear as movement. In an age when superstition was widespread, many people interpreted these illusions as signs of something supernatural. Even practical-minded individuals felt the tension that came with stepping into darkness. Inside homes, the situation was not much better. Light sources illuminated only small areas, leaving corners and ceilings in shadow. Families gathered close to the hearth or candle, conducting evening activities within a limited circle of light. Beyond that circle, darkness pressed in. If someone needed to move across the room, they often did so cautiously, feeling their way along furniture. In wealthier households, multiple candles might be used, but even then the lighting was dim compared to modern standards. Smoke from tallow candles and hearth fires filled the air, making the light hazy and irritating the eyes. The smell of burning fat lingered, adding to the atmosphere. Doors and windows offered little insulation, and drafts caused flames to flicker, casting shifting patterns on walls. These moving shadows could make rooms feel alive, reinforcing the sense that night was unpredictable. The absence of reliable clocks meant people judged time by natural cues. Once darkness fell, activity slowed not because people wanted quiet, but because light limited what they could do. Tasks requiring precision, such as sewing or tool work, became difficult. Reading was rare at night, especially among those without access to good candles. Instead, people spoke, prayed, or prepared for sleep. But even then, night did not guarantee rest. The darkness outside remained a constant presence, and any unusual sound might draw attention. A knock at the door after sunset was unexpected and sometimes alarming. Visitors arriving late could cause concern, as nighttime travel was unusual and potentially dangerous. In rural areas, darkness felt even deeper. Without dense clusters of buildings, there were fewer light sources. Fields and forests stretched into blackness. A farmer stepping outside might see only the faint outline of nearby structures, with everything beyond swallowed by night. Sounds carried farther in the countryside, and the howl of wind across open land or the rustle of animals in fields could feel eerie. Traveling between villages at night was especially risky. Paths were narrow, and without light, it was easy to stray into ditches or lose direction entirely. Some people used the moon to guide them, but cloudy skies removed even that aid. Fires and hearths served as focal points of safety. Families gathered around them not only for warmth but for reassurance. The glow represented a small island of visibility in an otherwise dark world. Stepping beyond that glow meant entering uncertainty. Children grew up understanding these boundaries, often warned not to wander after dark. Parents emphasized caution, teaching them that night held dangers both real and imagined. The darkness also influenced social rhythms. Many communities effectively shut down after sunset. Shops closed, workshops stopped, and streets emptied. Those still outside moved with purpose, trying to reach home quickly. The quiet that settled over towns was not peaceful in the modern sense. It was tense, shaped by caution. Occasionally distant lights appeared as someone carried a lantern, but these moving points of brightness were rare. For most of the night the town remained submerged in shadow. Even moonlit nights offered limited help. The moon's position changed, and its light created stark contrasts rather than uniform illumination. Bright patches alternated with deep darkness, making it difficult to judge distance. Someone stepping from a lit area into shadow could suddenly lose sight of the ground. This uneven lighting contributed to accidents. Darkness also influenced architecture. Buildings often leaned over streets, especially in crowded towns. Upper floors extended outward, narrowing passages. During the day, this provided shade and protection from weather. At night, it created tunnels of darkness where even moonlight struggled to reach. These tight spaces amplified the sense of confinement and risk. Anyone moving through them did so cautiously, aware that someone else might be hidden nearby. The absence of artificial light meant that night and day were sharply divided. There was no gradual fading into evening activity. Instead, once the sun set, the environment changed completely. People adapted by planning carefully, finishing essential tasks before dusk. If something was forgotten, it often waited until morning. This habit shaped daily life, reinforcing the idea that night was not a time for exploration but for retreat. Yet emergencies sometimes forced people outside. A sick animal, a crying child, or a sudden need for water might require stepping into darkness. These moments highlighted how vulnerable individuals were without light. Carrying a candle outdoors was risky because wind could extinguish it, and dripping wax or falling sparks could start fires. Lanterns offered some protection, but they were not common in poorer households. Many simply relied on memory and careful movement. The darkness of medieval nights was not just a physical condition, it shaped emotions, behavior, and community life. It limited movement, increased risk, and heightened awareness. Every step taken after sunset required attention. Every sound carried meaning. In a world without reliable illumination, night transformed familiar places into uncertain terrain, and people moved through it with caution born from experience. Theft, assaults, and drunken fights were common after sunset. Taverns stayed open late, and alcohol flowed freely, creating an atmosphere that grew louder and more unpredictable as the night deepened. These establishments were more than just places to drink. They were social hubs where travelers, laborers, merchants, and locals gathered to exchange news, gamble, argue, and sometimes settle disputes. By evening, the air inside taverns became thick with smoke from hearth fires and candles, mixed with the smell of spilled ale, sweat, and food. As mugs were refilled again and again, voices rose. Conversations that began friendly could easily turn confrontational. Insults were taken seriously, and honor mattered deeply in medieval society. A careless remark or perceived slight could escalate into shouting, and shouting often led to shoving. Once physical contact began, others might join in, either to defend a friend or simply because the tension spread quickly in crowded spaces. Knives were commonly carried for everyday use, and during heated moments they could be drawn. Fights that began as minor disagreements sometimes ended in injury or death. When these confrontations spilled into the streets, they added to the chaos of nighttime towns. Drunken individuals staggered into dark alleyways, bumping into others, knocking over objects, and sometimes provoking strangers. The lack of lighting made it difficult to see expressions or gestures clearly, increasing the chance of misunderstanding. Someone brushing past another in darkness might be interpreted as an intentional shove, leading to sudden confrontation. Without strong policing, few people intervened. Most avoided involvement, stepping aside or retreating indoors, allowing disputes to unfold unchecked. Theft flourished in this environment. Pickpockets targeted crowded taverns, slipping hands into purses or cutting strings that held coins. Outside, thieves waited near tavern doors, watching for patrons who appeared heavily intoxicated. These individuals were easy targets. A drunken traveler might be followed quietly, then robbed in a shadowed corner. Resistance was risky, and many victims were too disoriented to respond quickly. Even if they realized what had happened, the darkness made it nearly impossible to identify the culprit. In markets and trade districts, goods left unattended overnight could disappear. Stalls were sometimes covered but not always secured, and thieves used darkness to remove items without detection. Homes were also vulnerable. Doors and shutters provided some protection, but they were not foolproof. A determined intruder could force entry, especially if residents were asleep. In poorer areas, structures were fragile, and gaps in walls or roofs could be exploited. The fear of burglary influenced behavior. Families sometimes kept valuables hidden or slept lightly, listening for unusual sounds. The presence of taverns amplified nighttime movement. Patrons came and went at all hours, creating constant foot traffic. Some left in groups, singing loudly, while others departed alone, weaving through streets. Their noise carried across narrow lanes, echoing between wooden buildings. Laughter mixed with arguments, and occasionally the crash of overturned furniture or broken pottery signaled trouble. Dogs barked in response to commotion, adding to the soundscape. Horses tethered outside inns stamped their hooves, reacting to shouting or sudden movement. The combination of human and animal noise made medieval nights far from silent. Street confrontations sometimes involved rival groups. Apprentices from different workshops, soldiers passing through, or residents of neighboring districts might clash. These conflicts could be spontaneous or rooted in ongoing tensions. Without strong authority to separate them, fights spread quickly. Bystanders tried to avoid involvement, but in crowded streets escape was not always easy. Someone could be caught in the middle unintentionally, pushed or struck while trying to pass. Injuries were common, and medical help was limited. Even minor wounds risked infection, turning nighttime violence into longer-term danger. Gambling also contributed to disputes. Dice games and card-like activities were popular in taverns. Money changed hands, and accusations of cheating were frequent. When someone believed they had been deceived, tempers flared. Because many players were already intoxicated, reasoning gave way to anger. A thrown punch could spark wider conflict, with friends joining on both sides. Tavern keepers sometimes attempted to restore order, but their authority depended on respect and physical presence. Some succeeded, while others struggled to control unruly crowds. The outside environment compounded the chaos. Streets were narrow, and buildings stood close together. When noise erupted, it echoed, making disturbances seem larger than they were. Residents trying to sleep heard shouting, footsteps, and the occasional crash. Windows might open as people looked out, trying to understand what was happening. But visibility was limited, and many quickly shut themselves inside again, unwilling to risk involvement. The lack of uniform law enforcement meant that response varied widely. In some towns, watchmen might intervene, but they were few and often cautious. Approaching a group of fighting men carried risk, especially if the watchman was alone. Some simply called out warnings, hoping to disperse crowds. Others used staffs to push combatants apart. Their lanterns illuminated only small areas, leaving much of the street in shadow. If a fight moved beyond that circle of light, it continued unseen. Theft extended beyond individuals to organized efforts. Groups sometimes worked together, one distracting while another stole. In darkness, coordination was easier. A loud argument near a stall could draw attention while a partner quietly removed goods. These tactics were difficult to counter without consistent lighting. Travelers were especially vulnerable. Arriving late in unfamiliar towns, they often carried money or valuables. Thieves recognized this and watched entry points. Someone searching for an inn might be approached with false offers of guidance, only to be led into isolated areas. Resistance could lead to violence, and the victim might be left injured and disoriented. Even locals faced risk. Returning home after drinking, they might stumble, fall, or become targets. Intoxication reduced awareness, making them less able to defend themselves. Some were robbed while unconscious, their belongings taken before they woke. The soundscape of medieval nights reflected this mixture of activity. Singing was common, sometimes cheerful, sometimes slurred. Groups leaving taverns chanted or recited verses. Others shouted insults across streets. Doors slammed and footsteps echoed on uneven ground. Wooden carts occasionally moved at night, their wheels creaking loudly. The combination created an atmosphere that shifted between lively and threatening. Not every sound meant danger, but it was difficult to distinguish harmless noise from trouble. Residents adapted by listening carefully. A sudden silence after shouting could signal that a fight had ended or moved elsewhere. A sharp cry might indicate injury. Some communities developed informal responses. Neighbors checked on each other or men stepped outside together to investigate. But these efforts varied and were not always effective. Many preferred to remain indoors, prioritizing safety. Alcohol played a central role in sustaining nighttime activity. Drinking was common, partly because water quality was unreliable. Ale and wine were safer and widely consumed. Taverns provided warmth and companionship, making them attractive gathering places. As night progressed, judgment weakened. People who might avoid confrontation during the day became more aggressive. Minor disputes over seating, spilled drinks, or gambling losses escalated. The physical environment contributed to accidents. In darkness, someone leaving a tavern could trip over uneven ground or collide with a post. Falls led to injuries, and without immediate care, even a broken bone posed serious risk. Others might attempt to help, but intoxication reduced effectiveness. Some incidents were purely accidental, yet still dangerous. Animals added unpredictability. Dogs roamed streets, attracted by food scraps. A startled animal might bark or snap, provoking reaction. Horses tethered near inns sometimes kicked if disturbed. Someone stumbling into them in darkness risked injury. These interactions added to the sense that night was uncontrolled. The boundaries between public and private space blurred. With doors opening frequently and voices carrying, disturbances spread quickly. A fight outside could wake entire households. Some residents shouted from windows urging quiet, while others ignored the noise. Over time, people grew accustomed to this pattern, accepting nighttime chaos as part of life. Yet fear remained. The possibility of being caught in violence or targeted by thieves shaped behavior. Many avoided taverns altogether, especially older individuals or families. Those who did attend often left early to reduce risk. Nighttime chaos also affected reputation. Certain districts became known for disorder, attracting those seeking excitement and deterring others. Travelers learned to avoid these areas if possible. But information spread slowly, and newcomers often discovered risks firsthand. The interplay of alcohol, darkness, limited authority, and crowded conditions created an environment where conflict and crime flourished. Medieval nights were not uniformly violent, but unpredictability was constant. People navigating streets after sunset did so with caution, aware that noise and movement could signal anything from harmless celebration to sudden danger. In crowded towns and cities, the sounds of movement did not stop when darkness fell. The rumble of wooden wheels on uneven streets sometimes echoed late into the night as carts were moved to storage or goods were quietly transported before morning markets. Hooves struck packed earth, chains rattled and doors creaked open and shut. But alongside these human sounds came another presence that defined medieval nights: animals. Medieval settlements were not neatly separated from livestock the way modern cities are. Animals lived alongside people, sharing streets, courtyards, and even homes. Pigs, chickens, goats, and dogs roamed freely in many places, particularly in poorer districts where regulation was minimal. At night, these animals became more active. Pigs snuffled through refuse piles, overturning scraps in search of food. Their grunts and squeals carried through narrow lanes, sometimes startling those trying to sleep. Chickens fluttered and shifted in coops, disturbed by noise or predators. Dogs barked at passing shadows, responding to unfamiliar footsteps or distant arguments. The constant presence of animals meant that silence was rare, and their unpredictable behavior added to the sense that night was uncontrolled. Rats were perhaps the most pervasive nighttime companions. Drawn by food waste and shelter, they thrived in medieval environments. Narrow alleys, wooden walls, and thatched roofs provided countless hiding places. When darkness settled, rats emerged in large numbers. They scurried along beams, darted across floors, and climbed into storage containers. The scratching of claws inside walls or beneath beds was a familiar sound. Families often tried to protect their food, but containers were not always secure. Grain sacks were gnawed open, bread was nibbled, and stored meat could be spoiled. The presence of rats also brought fleas, which lived in their fur and spread easily to humans. These insects contributed to disease and discomfort, making restful sleep difficult. Even those accustomed to such conditions found the sensation of insects crawling or biting disturbing. Houses themselves offered little protection. Many were constructed from wood and plaster, with gaps that allowed rodents to enter. Thatched roofs provided warmth and nesting material, making them attractive shelters. At night, the rustling overhead signaled movement, and bits of straw sometimes fell as animals burrowed. Attempts to drive them away were often temporary. Cats were valued for their ability to hunt rodents, but even they could not eliminate the problem entirely. Their nighttime prowling added another layer of sound as they leapt onto surfaces, chased prey, and occasionally fought with other cats. These encounters produced hisses, yowls, and sudden thuds that could wake entire households. The presence of insects extended beyond fleas. Lice were common, living in clothing and bedding. Straw mattresses, widely used among poorer families, provided ideal environments for insects. Over time, bedding accumulated dust, crumbs, and moisture, attracting pests. Shifting in bed might disturb these inhabitants, causing them to move. The itching they caused made sleep restless. People scratched, turned, and sometimes rose to shake bedding or add fuel to the fire, briefly illuminating the room. Even wealthier households were not immune, though they might have slightly better bedding. Cleanliness standards were limited by resources, and laundering was labor-intensive. The smell inside homes at night reflected these conditions. Fires burned for warmth and cooking, releasing smoke that lingered under low ceilings. Combined with the odors of animals, stored food, and human activity, the air grew heavy. Ventilation was minimal, especially in colder months when openings were closed to retain heat. As a result, the nighttime environment indoors could feel stifling. People sleeping in close quarters shared body heat and breath, intensifying the atmosphere. Entire families often slept in a single room, sometimes in the same bed. Privacy was almost non-existent. Children shifted, adults moved, and the collective motion created a constant rustling. If one person woke, others might stir. The practice of segmented sleep added to nighttime activity. Many people went to bed soon after dark, slept for several hours, then woke around midnight. During this waking period they might tend the fire, speak quietly, or perform small tasks. The glow of embers provided limited light, casting dim illumination. Someone rising to add wood produced sparks and brief brightness. These movements, though routine, contributed to the sense that night was not a single block of rest, but a cycle of activity. Outside, animals continued their routines. Horses in stables shifted weight, stamping hooves against ground. The sound traveled through wooden walls. If startled by noise, they snorted or kicked, creating sudden bursts of sound. Livestock tethered near homes also moved, sometimes tangling ropes or knocking over containers. The interaction between human noise and animal response created a chain reaction. A shout in the street might trigger barking dogs, which in turn disturbed chickens, leading to flapping and clucking. This cascade ensured that disturbances rarely remained isolated. The environment of medieval towns encouraged such interactions. Waste disposal practices left food scraps accessible, attracting animals. Narrow streets concentrated sound, amplifying it. Buildings close together meant that movement in one household was heard in another. At night, when other activities slowed, these smaller noises became more noticeable. People grew skilled at interpreting them. The scratch of a rat differed from the heavier step of a cat. The grunt of a pig signaled scavenging, while the clatter of hooves suggested movement in a stable. These distinctions mattered because they helped residents assess whether a disturbance required attention. Despite familiarity, annoyance persisted. Interrupted sleep affected mood and productivity. Farmers and laborers needed rest, yet nighttime noise often disrupted it. Some households attempted to reduce disturbances by securing animals or cleaning bedding, but resources limited effectiveness. Over time, people accepted these conditions as normal. The rhythm of medieval nights included these sounds and sensations. Even the act of preparing for sleep reflected awareness of animals. Food was sometimes hung from beams to keep it out of reach of rodents. Containers were covered. Doors were closed carefully to prevent entry. Yet complete control was impossible. The natural environment blended with human settlement, and animals exploited every opportunity. This coexistence shaped nighttime experience. Instead of silence, there was a constant undercurrent of movement. Instead of stillness, there was subtle activity in walls, roofs, and streets. The knowledge that unseen creatures moved nearby added to the psychological dimension of night. People might lie awake listening, imagining the paths rats took or wondering what animal rustled outside. In colder seasons, animals sought warmth indoors, increasing encounters. A stray dog might push through a partially open door. Chickens sometimes roosted inside homes. These intrusions blurred boundaries further. The warmth of animals could be useful, but their presence added smell and noise. The combination of shared space, insects, and rodents created a complex nighttime environment. It was neither peaceful nor entirely chaotic, but constantly active. Sleep occurred within this backdrop of movement and sound. Over generations, people adapted, learning to rest despite interruptions. Yet the underlying reality remained. Medieval nights were filled with life, much of it small, persistent, and impossible to ignore. During the hours when many people woke in the middle of the night, the atmosphere inside medieval homes often shifted into a strange, quiet activity. The fire in the hearth might have burned low, leaving glowing embers that cast a dim red light across the room. Someone would rise slowly from bed, careful not to disturb others too much, and move toward the hearth to add a small piece of wood. The sound of the logs settling into the embers produced a faint crackle, followed by a small flare of flame that briefly illuminated the interior. In those moments the room revealed its cramped and cluttered reality. Rough wooden beams above, simple furniture pushed against walls, bundles of tools or clothing hanging from pegs, and straw bedding spread across the floor or piled on simple frames. These midnight awakenings were not unusual. Many people considered them a natural part of sleep. After resting for several hours, they spent some time awake before drifting into a second sleep. During this waking period, some prayed quietly, believing the stillness of night made it an ideal time for reflection. Others spoke softly with family members who were also awake. A few used the time to complete small tasks that required little light, such as mending clothing near the fire or preparing tools for the next day. The flickering light from the hearth or a small candle provided just enough illumination to see basic shapes, but not enough to work comfortably for long. In poorer households, the space itself made movement difficult. Entire families often slept in a single room, and sometimes several people shared the same bed. Beds were not the soft mattresses people expect today. Many consisted of wooden frames filled with straw or rough padding. Over time the straw compressed and gathered dust, crumbs, and insects. When someone shifted their weight, the bedding rustled and released faint clouds of dust into the air. Blankets were heavy but not always clean, and they were shared among family members for warmth during colder months. Privacy did not exist in the way modern people understand it. Children slept beside parents, siblings crowded together, and sometimes servants or laborers slept in the same space if they worked for a household. The closeness meant that every movement was felt. If one person woke and turned over, others might stir as well. Conversations, even whispered ones, carried easily through the small space. The smell inside these homes could be overwhelming. Fires burned indoors for cooking and warmth, and although smoke escaped through openings in the roof or walls, much of it lingered. The air often felt thick and hazy, especially during winter when doors and shutters were kept closed to preserve heat. The smell of smoke mixed with the odors of animals, food, damp clothing, and unwashed bodies. Many homes stored supplies in the same room where people slept, including sacks of grain, dried meat, and cooking utensils. These items added their own scents to the environment. Because ventilation was poor, the combination created an atmosphere that was difficult to escape. Over time people became accustomed to it, but newcomers often found it stifling. The constant presence of smoke irritated eyes and lungs, and soot slowly gathered on beams and walls, darkening the interior. Even wealthier households with larger rooms faced similar issues, though they might have slightly better chimneys or more space between occupants. Beyond discomfort, the most serious threat inside medieval homes at night was fire. Nearly every source of light or warmth involved an open flame. Candles burned on wooden tables, torches sometimes flickered in hallways, and hearth fires remained active for cooking and heating. All of these could become dangerous if not carefully managed. A candle tipped by accident could ignite cloth or straw. A spark from the hearth might leap onto the floor. In homes where bedding was made of dry straw and roofs were thatched with tightly packed reeds, flames could spread with alarming speed. People understood this risk and often tried to keep fires controlled, but accidents still occurred frequently. During the night the danger was even greater because people were asleep or only half awake. If a flame began to grow unnoticed, it could consume a room before anyone realized what was happening. Once a fire started, stopping it was extremely difficult. Medieval towns were often built with houses pressed close together, their wooden frames touching or nearly touching. If one building caught fire, the heat quickly spread to neighboring structures. Flames leapt from roof to roof, carried by wind and fueled by dry materials. At night, when visibility was low and residents were confused from sudden awakening, the response could be chaotic. Someone might shout a warning from the street or ring a bell, causing people to rush outside in panic. Families scrambled to gather children, valuables, or animals while smoke filled the air. Buckets of water were passed along chains of desperate residents, drawn from wells or nearby rivers, but the amount of water available was often far too little to stop a fast-moving blaze. Sparks drifted through the air and landed on roofs further away, creating new fires. Entire neighborhoods sometimes burned before morning arrived. Because of this constant threat, people treated fire with a mixture of reliance and fear. The hearth provided warmth, cooked meals, and gave the only reliable source of light, yet it also represented the possibility of destruction. At night many households tried to reduce the danger by covering embers or carefully arranging logs so flames would burn low. Still, the unpredictability of sparks meant that no precaution was perfect. The fear of waking to the smell of smoke lingered in the back of many minds. In towns where fires had occurred before, stories circulated about families who lost everything in a single night. These memories made people cautious but also aware that disaster could arrive without warning. The risk was not limited to homes alone. Workshops and storage buildings often contained flammable materials such as wood, cloth, oil, or grain. If a fire started in one of these places during the night, it could burn intensely before anyone noticed. The glow of flames might only become visible once the blaze was already large. By then, stopping it required enormous effort from the entire community. Nighttime fires created scenes of confusion and urgency. Bells rang loudly, people shouted directions, and the darkness was suddenly filled with flickering orange light as flames illuminated the sky. Residents formed lines to pass buckets, while others climbed onto roofs to tear away burning material. The heat, smoke, and noise made the situation chaotic. Sometimes the only effective solution was to demolish nearby structures to create a gap that stopped the fire's spread. Even this was dangerous work carried out in darkness and panic. Inside homes that had not caught fire, the fear of such an event influenced nightly routines. Before going to sleep, many people checked the hearth, making sure flames were low and contained. Candles were extinguished carefully, and doors were secured. Yet despite these precautions, the possibility of fire remained a constant part of medieval life. The same flames that warmed families during cold nights also had the power to destroy entire communities. This fragile balance defined the experience of night indoors. People gathered around the hearth for comfort, shared stories or prayers, and eventually returned to sleep during the second half of the night. But beneath the quiet moments there was always the awareness that a small spark could transform everything. The combination of crowded living spaces, smoke-filled air, restless sleep, and ever-present fire risk made medieval nights inside the home far from peaceful. Even within the supposed safety of their own walls, families lived with discomfort and uncertainty, surrounded by conditions that modern households would find almost unimaginable. Superstition shaped how many people understood the night, and once darkness settled, imagination filled the spaces that limited light left behind. Without clear visibility, ordinary sights and sounds often took on deeper meaning. A flickering shadow across a wall might be interpreted as something moving just beyond view. The creak of timber as buildings cooled after the day's warmth could sound like footsteps. Winds slipping through narrow alleys produced low, whispering tones that seemed almost like voices. For communities that already believed the world was filled with spiritual forces, they believed the world was filled with spiritual forces. These sensations reinforced the idea that night belonged to more than just human activity. Stories of spirits, wandering souls, and unseen beings circulated widely. Children grew up hearing tales that warned them not to wander after dark, and adults repeated these stories, sometimes half believing them themselves. In rural areas, the darkness beyond the last house felt especially vast, and any distant light or movement might be interpreted as something supernatural. Even in towns, narrow streets and uneven lighting created pockets of shadow that seemed to swallow sound and shape. When someone passed through such areas alone, their own footsteps echoed back, giving the impression of being followed. This heightened awareness affected behavior. People often preferred to move in groups at night, not only for safety from crime but also for comfort against the unknown. The ringing of church bells played a significant role in nighttime life. Bells marked hours, signaled warnings, and called communities together. When a bell sounded unexpectedly during the night, it could jolt residents awake. The deep tone carried across rooftops and through streets, echoing against stone walls and wooden facades. People listened carefully, trying to interpret the meaning. A rapid or irregular ringing might indicate fire. A slow, measured toll could signal death. In some cases, bells were used to warn of approaching danger, such as raiders or other threats. Because there were no modern communication systems, the bell's sound was one of the few ways to alert an entire community quickly. The sudden interruption of sleep, combined with darkness, created confusion. Individuals rushed outside, trying to determine what was happening. Lanterns appeared in doorways, casting small circles of light as neighbors spoke urgently. The emotional impact of these moments was intense. Even if the alarm turned out to be minor, the experience reinforced the sense that night was unpredictable. Superstitions sometimes influenced how these events were interpreted. A bell ringing at an unusual hour might be seen as an omen, especially if no clear cause was found. Such interpretations blended religious belief with fear, shaping how people responded to the unknown. In castles, nights carried their own atmosphere. Guards patrolled walls, moving slowly along battlements. The wind at higher elevations could be strong and cold, tugging at cloaks and making torches flicker. The flame of a torch did not burn steadily, it danced and sputtered, casting long, shifting shadows across stone surfaces. As guards walked, their footsteps echoed faintly, amplified by the hard materials around them. They listened for unusual sounds beyond the walls, the rustle of movement in fields, the distant bark of dogs, or the faint clink of metal. Even small noises could draw attention, as vigilance was essential. The darkness outside the castle was deep, and shapes beyond torchlight blurred together. A moving shadow could be an animal, a wandering traveler, or something imagined. Guards relied on experience and caution, often pausing to look and listen. Inside the castle, activity continued even after many residents slept. Servants worked late, tending fires, cleaning halls, or preparing items for the next day. Their footsteps along corridors echoed, sometimes startling those half asleep. Large stone rooms retained cold, and fires were necessary to keep them bearable. Servants moved between rooms carrying embers or wood, the glow of their lamps briefly illuminating tapestries, armor stands, and furniture before fading again. Drafts slipped through narrow windows and under doors, causing flames to waver. This created moving shadows that seemed alive, especially in long corridors. Even members of the nobility experienced discomfort. Their chambers might be larger than those of common households, but insulation was poor. Thick walls held cold, and windows allowed wind to enter. Heavy curtains and blankets helped, yet the chill remained. The quiet inside such rooms was often broken by distant sounds. A door closing somewhere in the castle, a guard calling to another, or the low murmur of servants. These sounds reminded occupants that night was not entirely still. Superstitions existed within castles as well. Stories of hauntings or past events circulated among residents. A dark hallway or unused tower could gain a reputation for strange occurrences. Whether believed fully or not, such tales influenced perception. A sudden noise in a quiet corridor might cause unease, and even those who dismissed superstition sometimes felt tension in the darkness. The architecture of castles amplified these sensations. Long corridors, spiral staircases, and large chambers created echoes and shifting acoustics. A whisper carried farther than expected, and footsteps seemed to follow from behind. Outside the castle walls, surrounding villages also experienced nighttime uncertainty. If a bell rang or a messenger arrived, word spread quickly. People gathered in small groups, discussing possibilities. The absence of immediate information meant rumors filled gaps. Some speculated about attack, others about fire, and still others about supernatural signs. This mixture of fear and speculation added to the emotional intensity of night. Even when nothing serious occurred, the memory lingered. The following night, individuals might listen more carefully, anticipating another disturbance. The combination of superstition, limited lighting, and intermittent alarms created a psychological environment where imagination played a strong role. Nighttime sounds carried symbolic weight. A dog howling could be interpreted as a warning. The sudden silence of animals might seem suspicious. These interpretations were shaped by shared beliefs passed through generations. While practical concerns such as crime and fire were real, the added layer of superstition influenced how people experienced them. The night was not just physically dark but mentally charged. Even routine activities like a guard's patrol or a servant's movement contributed to this atmosphere. Each flicker of torchlight, each echo in stone corridors, and each unexpected bell reinforced the sense that darkness transformed familiar places into uncertain territory. Inside castles, servants continued working long after many residents had gone to sleep. Their duties did not end with the setting sun. Fires needed to be maintained, corridors tidied, and preparations made for the following day. The sound of quiet footsteps echoed along stone floors as they moved from room to room, carrying small lamps or candles that cast narrow circles of light. These lights briefly revealed details of tapestries, wooden chests, and suits of armor before fading again into shadow. The walls of castles were thick and cold, and even with fires burning, rooms often remained chilly. Drafts slipped through narrow windows and under heavy doors, making flames flicker and causing shadows to shift constantly. This movement created a sense that the space itself was alive. The faint rustle of fabric, the crackle of embers, and the distant murmur of voices combined into a background of subtle activity. Nobles sleeping in their chambers were not immune to discomfort. Their beds might be larger and layered with blankets, but insulation was poor, and the chill of night crept in. Curtains around beds were used to trap warmth, yet they also reduced airflow, making the interior stuffy. Those who woke in the night sometimes listened to the distant sounds of the castle, aware that even in supposed security, movement continued. Guards patrolled walls outside, and their calls occasionally carried inward, reminding everyone that vigilance never ceased. Beyond castle walls, travelers faced some of the most difficult conditions. Roads were rarely paved and often wound through forests, fields, and uneven terrain. During daylight, these paths were challenging enough, but at night they became hazardous. Without consistent lighting, travelers relied on memory, moonlight, or simple lanterns if they had them. A lantern illuminated only a small area, and wind could extinguish it. Losing that light meant immediate disorientation. Trees and shrubs blended together and familiar landmarks vanished. A wrong turn might lead into marshy ground, a ditch, or dense woodland. The risk of injury increased dramatically. Horses could stumble, and wagons might tip if wheels struck hidden obstacles. Because of these dangers, many preferred to stop traveling before sunset. However, circumstances sometimes forced people to continue. Merchants eager to reach markets, messengers carrying urgent news, or individuals delayed by weather found themselves on roads after dark. These travelers were vulnerable not only to accidents but also to bandits. Lonely routes provided opportunities for robbery. A small group hiding behind trees could ambush someone with little warning. The darkness helped conceal movement and identity. Victims often had no clear view of attackers, making resistance difficult. Even if a traveler escaped, the fear of such encounters lingered. Inns were spaced irregularly along roads, and missing one before nightfall created additional problems. Sleeping outdoors exposed travelers to cold, dampness, and animals. A small fire might provide warmth, but lighting it required time and increased visibility, potentially attracting unwanted attention. Some chose to rest quietly, wrapping themselves in cloaks and hoping for morning. The sounds of night in open landscapes were different from those in towns. Wind moved through trees, producing low murmurs. Insects buzzed near the ground. Occasionally, distant animal calls echoed, reminding travelers of their isolation. These sounds, combined with darkness, heightened tension. Every movement seemed significant. Travelers often slept lightly, ready to respond if something approached. Medical emergencies at night added another layer of uncertainty. If someone fell ill or was injured, assistance was limited. There were no organized services to summon quickly. Families relied on their own knowledge or local healers who might live some distance away. Fetching help required venturing into darkness, navigating streets or paths with limited light. The urgency of illness clashed with the risks of nighttime travel. A messenger might hurry through town, knocking on doors, calling softly to avoid waking everyone, yet hoping to find aid. Time lost in darkness could worsen conditions. Inside homes, illness disrupted sleep. A sick person might groan or cough, drawing attention. Others rose to tend them, adjusting bedding, offering water, or preparing simple remedies near the fire. The flicker of flame illuminated worried faces. Without clear understanding of many diseases, families relied on comfort and prayer. The quiet hours of night made these moments feel longer and more intense. Weather intensified all of these challenges. Rain turned roads into slippery mud, making travel dangerous. Water pooled in ruts, and stepping into unseen puddles soaked clothing. Wet conditions also dampened fires and extinguished candles. Storms brought strong winds that rattled shutters and howled through gaps in buildings. Thunder startled both people and animals, sometimes causing horses to panic or dogs to bark continuously. Lightning briefly illuminated landscapes, revealing shapes in stark contrast before plunging everything back into darkness. Winter nights were particularly harsh. They lasted longer, and cold penetrated poorly insulated structures. Frost formed on windows, and breath became visible indoors. Fires burned constantly, yet warmth was uneven. People wrapped themselves in blankets, huddling together. Outside, snow-covered paths hiding obstacles beneath. Travel became slower and riskier. The quiet of snowfall muffled sound, creating an eerie stillness broken only by occasional movement. Despite these difficulties, communities adapted. Travelers learned to plan carefully, leaving early to avoid night. Families prepared for emergencies by keeping small supplies near the hearth. Guards maintained patrols, and watchmen listened for disturbances. Yet uncertainty always remained. Night transformed ordinary environments into spaces where vision was limited, help was distant, and conditions changed quickly. Whether inside castles, on lonely roads, or within crowded homes, people experienced a mixture of caution and resilience. They relied on routine and familiarity, but they also understood that darkness introduced variables beyond their control. Every unusual sound, shift in weather, or unexpected knock at the door carried potential significance. The medieval night was not simply a time of rest, but a period filled with subtle activity, risk, and constant awareness. By the time the first hints of dawn appeared on the horizon, medieval nights were far from over for many people, and for others, the night's chaos lingered in memory, shaping the start of their day. The darkest hours had tested vigilance, patience, and endurance, and the small routines and precautions that families, travelers, and castle residents had adopted were the only shields against countless hazards. As the faint light of morning began to filter through narrow windows or gaps in doors, those who had remained awake, tending fires, comforting the sick, or patrolling streets and battlements, could finally exhale a tentative sense of relief, though the work was far from finished. While towns and villages appeared calm under the soft glow of dawn, the evidence of the night's turmoil often remained. Streets were littered with broken mugs, overturned carts, and scattered refuse. Animals that had roamed freely during darkness returned to their stalls or coops, leaving behind traces of their activity, hoofprints in mud, droppings, and trampled scraps of food. Families emerging from homes noticed that doors had been left ajar by those who had ventured out in emergencies, and neighbors exchanged stories of minor disputes, fires, or accidents that had erupted in the hours before daylight. In wealthier households and castles, servants rose to prepare breakfast, tend lingering embers in hearths, and begin cleaning the remnants of nocturnal work. The flickering morning light illuminated rooms that had been cloaked in shadow, revealing soot-stained beams, the dust of straw bedding, and the subtle disarray left behind by families shifting through segmented sleep. Even those who had slept through most of the night were greeted by the sensory evidence of activity, the smell of smoke still lingering, the quiet chatter of early risers, and the movement of animals as they resumed their routines. For travelers who had survived the night's hazards, the first light brought not only relief but a renewed sense of urgency. They quickly assessed their surroundings, planning routes that avoided the worst of the previous night's dangers, and hoping to reach the next inn, market, or town before the hazards of human and animal activity multiplied again. Paths through forests, fields, or unpaved roads could be treacherous at any hour, but daylight allowed travelers to navigate obstacles, identify landmarks, and assess the condition of the terrain with greater certainty. Rivers, ditches, and muddy stretches that had been nearly invisible in the darkness now revealed themselves clearly, and travelers adjusted accordingly. Bandits, aware that visibility increased at dawn, often retreated or concealed themselves, reducing the immediate risk but not eliminating it entirely, as even well-lit roads did not guarantee safety. The cycle of human adaptation to night and day was mirrored in towns and villages, where laborers, merchants, and farmers began their daily routines once again. Shops opened, market stalls were prepared, and craftsmen resumed work in workshops. Yet the echoes of the night remained in the minds of residents. Stories of fights, thefts, accidents, or supernatural sightings were recounted in whispers or casual conversation, and these anecdotes became part of the collective understanding of night's dangers. Parents reminded children of precautions, travelers shared warnings with fellow journeyers, and town officials, when aware of serious incidents, adjusted watch schedules or reinforced rules for nighttime safety. The psychological imprint of night persisted. People moved cautiously in the early hours, aware that the residual fear and fatigue from darkness could affect judgment and attention. The unpredictability of the previous night informed behavior. Doors were secured, animals checked, and fires carefully tended to prevent another catastrophe. In rural areas, the transition from night to day was particularly striking. Fields that had been invisible in darkness now revealed crops, paths, and hazards that had been hidden. Farmers assessed damage caused by nocturnal animals, wind, or weather. Livestock was checked, ensuring that none had strayed or been injured. Early morning chores required balancing urgency with caution, as the same animals that were harmless in daylight could be unpredictable when frightened. Travelers leaving rural inns or way stations often felt relief at seeing the landscape fully illuminated. Forests that had been dense and threatening at night now seemed navigable, though their shadows still carried hints of the previous darkness. Birds called from trees, roosters announced the dawn, and small animals scurried across fields, signaling that activity had resumed and the world was no longer entirely under night's control. In castles, the change from night to day brought renewed energy but also reflection. Guards who had patrolled through darkness reported observations to superiors, noting unusual activity or potential hazards. Servants, exhausted from tending fires, cleaning, or assisting the nobility, prepared food and organized spaces disrupted by nighttime activity. Nobles, emerging from sleep, adjusted to daylight, often receiving reports of incidents that had occurred during the night. The awareness of night's dangers persisted in their planning, influencing defensive strategies, household routines, and daily schedules. Fire hazards were particularly prominent in the minds of residents after a night where embers flickered dangerously or accidents had been narrowly avoided. Households inspected hearths, reinforced chimneys, and checked that flammable materials were stored securely. Communities sometimes conducted broader assessments, especially if a nearby house had suffered damage, using lessons learned to prevent future disasters. In towns and villages, a sense of order gradually returned. Streets filled with merchants, laborers, and townsfolk. Children played cautiously, animals resumed their usual routines, and taverns prepared for daytime trade. Yet the knowledge that night would return, bringing darkness, noise, animals, and uncertainty, lingered in collective consciousness. Families, travelers, and townsfolk understood that the cycle of chaos and vigilance would repeat, and they continued to prepare for it through routines, precautions, and shared knowledge. Even after sunrise, the consequences of the night remained visible and palpable. Streets bore marks of human and animal movement. Evidence of crime or accident sometimes lingered, prompting investigations or conversations. Stories of supernatural sightings continued to circulate, often gaining embellishments as they were retold. The psychological impact of night was cumulative. A single night's experience could influence behavior for days, shaping routes taken, sleep patterns, and social interactions. Parents emphasized caution, travelers chose familiar paths, and communities adjusted their night watch systems in response to observed risks. Beyond the immediate effects, medieval nights also left long-term cultural and social imprints. Folklore, customs, and local laws often reflected lessons learned from nocturnal dangers. Superstitions reinforced safety practices, while practical strategies, such as segmented sleep or careful fire management, became habitual. Individuals internalized an awareness of unpredictability, balancing fear with resilience. People learned to navigate a world where night was not merely the absence of light but a complex period filled with hazards, activity, and social dynamics. The adaptation extended to every layer of society. Nobility, aware that castles were vulnerable to attack, maintained guards and planned defenses that accounted for darkness. Merchants secured goods and routes, understanding that thieves preferred the cover of night. Families developed sleeping arrangements, fire precautions, and routines that allowed them to survive the unpredictable hours. Children grew up learning how to listen for danger, move carefully, and respect the rhythms of night. Travelers developed strategies for timing journeys, choosing routes, and carrying supplies that would help them navigate the unpredictable nocturnal landscape. The cumulative result was a society attuned to the nuances of night. Darkness, noise, animals, superstition, crime, fire, and weather all contributed to a shared understanding of risk and the importance of preparation. While modern observers may imagine medieval nights as quiet or serene, the reality was a layered and continuous engagement with hazards that required vigilance, adaptation, and communal effort. Even as light returned, the lessons of the night persisted, shaping behavior, perception, and social structures. In every home, village, town, and castle, the memory of night influenced the day. People understood that the seemingly calm morning masked a world where chaos had reigned hours earlier and would return again in due time. This awareness fostered a culture of resilience, alertness, and caution, ensuring that medieval society, despite its lack of modern conveniences, survived the nightly trials imposed by darkness. In this way, medieval nights were not just a period of inactivity but a defining feature of daily life, shaping routines, social interaction, infrastructure, and imagination. The unpredictability and danger of night through darkness, noise, animals, crime, superstition, fire, and harsh weather demanded continuous adaptation. People responded with strategies that balanced survival, comfort, and social cohesion, creating an intricate system of behavior that persisted for centuries. Nights tested endurance and judgment, and they influenced everything from architecture and urban planning to folklore and cultural practices. Each sunrise revealed the remnants of activity, chaos, and adaptation, reinforcing the cyclical nature of medieval life. The memory of night's challenges persisted in every observation, decision, and story, ensuring that darkness remained a potent force in shaping human experience long after the first light appeared. It was a world where rest and danger existed side by side, where sleep was segmented, vigilance was constant, and the smallest sparks, literal or figurative, could alter lives. The night demanded respect, ingenuity, and community, and those who navigated it successfully carried the lessons into the daylight hours. Even in the quiet moments of morning, the echoes of the night remained, reminding everyone that medieval life was not separated into simple day and night, but was a continuous cycle of challenge, adaptation, and survival. Knowledge of the night passed from one generation to the next, through stories, habits, and practical instruction, embedding in the culture an intimate familiarity with darkness and its unpredictable consequences. This perpetual cycle ensured that medieval society endured despite the hazards, learning to thrive in a world where the night was far from silent, safe, or predictable. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the chaos, mystery, and unpredictable world of medieval nights. We've explored the crowded streets, the flickering fires in castles, the restless animals, the dangers of crime and accidents, the vigilance of guards, and the superstitions that colored every shadow and sound. Nights in the Middle Ages were far from quiet or serene. They were alive with movement, risk, and human ingenuity. From the lowliest homes to the grandest castles, every hour after sunset carried its own challenges and stories, shaping the lives of those who lived through them. By understanding these realities, we gain a deeper appreciation for how medieval people adapted, survived, and thrived despite the darkness surrounding them. Every shadow, every flicker of fire, every creak of timber was part of a living, breathing world that demanded awareness, courage, and resilience. If you enjoyed diving into this chaotic yet fascinating era, make sure to show your support for the channel. Hit the like button to let us know you appreciated the video. Share it with friends and family who love history. And don't forget to subscribe for more content exploring the mysteries, struggles, and extraordinary stories of the past. By subscribing, you'll never miss a video that brings history to life, from the quiet corners of medieval towns to the epic battles and legendary figures that shaped the world. We also invite you to leave your thoughts and questions in the comments. Which part of medieval life surprised you the most? Did you ever imagine nights could be this dangerous and unpredictable? Your engagement helps us create even better videos and share more incredible historical insights. Thank you for watching, and remember, history isn't just about the past, it's a story that continues to captivate, teach, and inspire us today. Stay curious, and we'll see you in the next video.